Good. Thank you, Patrick. So I wanted to introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our debaters and also give you an outline of the agenda of the debate. But we have purposefully selected a neutral moderator, Nicholas Sullivan. So he's the co-leader of the Fletcher School Leadership Program for Financial Inclusion, which is a residency program designed for central bankers, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's also been a Bellagio Fellow, visiting scholar at MIT's Legatum Center, and also a graduate of Harvard University. He is the author of many books, one of which is coming out, which seems quite interesting. It's called Money Real Quick, Kenya's Mobile Money Innovation. So he comes with a background as a founding partner of the Global Frontier Fund, a private equity fund of funds for frontier markets. So with that, let's welcome our moderator and also our other guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And Catherine, you forgot to mention that the other co-leader, Kim Wilson, is right here in the front row from the Financial Inclusion Program. Before I introduce the debaters, I just want to give you a little bit on the format. The winner of the vote will receive the first question, and then we will have two other questions for the two participants. The person to whom the question is addressed will speak for 5 minutes, and then the opponent will have 2 minutes to rebut or amplify or correct. And then we will have another round of voting while there's a 10-minute Q&A from all of you. And then after the 10-minute Q&A and the round of voting, each of the debaters will have 4 minutes to sum up their arguments. I won't say anything more about the topic, except that as I was coming over here, I was thinking that 10 years ago, you certainly wouldn't have been doing this, and maybe even 5 years ago. So it's quite interesting how much the role of private enterprise has kind of inserted itself into the role of international development, which used to be another sphere altogether. Okay, as for the debaters, on my left, on your right, wearing black but no tie, is Professor Lant Prichett, the Kennedy School, Professor of Practice of International Development, consultant to Google.org, Fellow at the Center for Global Development, Senior Fellow of BRED, and a co-editor of the Journal of Development Economics. He's worked several times at the World Bank before coming to Harvard, 1988 to 98, and actually worked with Larry Summers from 91 to 93 when Summers was a vice president there. Then worked for the World Bank in Indonesia and India, taught at the Kennedy School in between, and finally came back to Kennedy School in 2007. Michael Chu, on my right, also wearing black but with a tie, representing the business side, is a senior lecturer at the business school in the Initiative on Social Entrepreneurship. He's also a managing director at the IGNIA Fund, which is a venture capital fund in Mexico. He's an advisor to Pegasus, which is a private equity fund in Argentina. He is co-leader of Project Antares, which is a HBS public health initiative, co-initiative to develop high-impact primary care in poor countries. Before he came to Harvard, he was the CEO of Axion International. He's participated in the founding of several banks, Mi Banco in Peru, Banco Solidario, and Compramos Banco, which had a very successful IPO in Mexico. He also worked at KKR back in the 80s and is a consultant at Boston Consulting Group. So, where do we stand on the voting? Government has a large lead. So has everyone voted? 58% to 32%, with 8% abstaining or unsure?
What is that third option?
What is the third option?
It says option 3.
Option
Option
3.
3, I see.
Okay. So the first question goes to Professor Prichett, representing the government side. We would agree that ideally, basic services to the poor should be available to the poor. What is the government's responsibility vis-a-vis its citizens, i.e. which services, free or affordable, and why are they in many instances failing to address it? So 5 minutes to Professor Prichett.
Okay. So I want to start with the terms of the question that was asked, because it's very important to even my opinion about the right answer, which is what's more effective at providing services, business or government, right? Now, there's two key words in there that I want to make sure we understand before I even get to the question. One is it's providing, not producing. So we're not asking who is more effective of actually carrying out the logistics of delivering the services. It could well be that the government can contract with the private sector and the production of the services is actually much better done in the private sector, but it's still the ultimate responsibility of the government to provide those services. So again, the question isn't who's more effective at delivering the mail. The question is who is more effective at providing the delivery of the mail, which means assuming responsibility for the overall legal context, the overall institutional framework, and divvying up the responsibilities between the government and the private sector. So there's a governmental foundation within which the private sector can operate. Second, it's business or government. Notice that's not markets versus government. Business pursues profits within the scheme and prices that they're faced. If business can make profits by ripping people off, they will rip people's face off. Matter of fact, ripping someone's face off is a common term among business. If government structures it so that business can make profits by getting services to the poor, businesses will get services to the poor very effectively. I have no doubt of that. But if you leave it to business, they are neutral, completely neutral with respect to whether they make profits by ripping people's face off or whether they make profits by providing services to the poor. Business as business should be let done to do what businesses do. But without the underlying structure of governmental provision, business is completely incapable of getting services to the poor. So now let me move in that context of what I think the terms of the debate are. I'm not going to debate that the private sector shouldn't be actively engaged in the production of services. I'm just saying business left to its own devices will not produce such a framework because they can't produce the framework, and that without government and an effective government, what business will do is counterproductive. So when we get to why governments often fail because the politics of getting to services is wrong. So when you ask, what does governments owe citizens? Governments owe citizens what citizens demand of governments. There's no abstract answer to that question. It's you have a process of politics in which citizens demand services of their government. And so usually when government services fail, it's because the politics has failed. The solution to a failed politics is not more business. So let me just give you one example. In Pakistan, in Lahore, Pakistan, for a while, there were pipes under the street to deliver water in the normal way that the government provides water, by having pipes under the street or water utility. Okay. The politics were so terrible that the politicians realized they could shut the water off to those pipes and therefore create a demand for a business of tankers driving around and delivering water. Okay? Now, once that business gets going, relative to a government pipe with no water, the business is terrific. Look at those tankers out there effectively and efficiently getting water to the poor. The private sector's terrific. Except the private sector consisted of thugs in connection with government politicians who would use violence and intimidation to preserve their market sphere. So, was the private sector the answer to government failure? Or did the intervening of business into the provision of services make the whole context for providing services worse, in a way that then when you went to reform the government system to get the pipe waters back in the pipes, the politicians were against it. Why? They were in cahoots with business, making profits, getting services efficiently to the poor. So I will tell my next time, because I'm out of time, I will tell a nice Russian proverb.
2 minutes, Mr. Chu.
Right. Let me start also by some definitions. The first definition that I like to make is, what is basic services? And I think that basic services are those goods and services that have a disproportionate impact on the ability of people to realize the potential of their lives. So I'm talking about education, healthcare, housing, access to energy, water, telecommunications. Now, what's government's role in this? Well, I think government's role is to make sure that there's universal access to an effective option for these basic services. Now, however, often governments fail. Why do they fail? I think there are many reasons that account for the failure of government, but all of them, in essence, revolve around two basic things that affect government when the government is a direct provider of goods and services. And those two things are that government, as a direct provider of goods and services, has a failure, two respects. One is accountability, and the second is operating within a system that is structured to not be incented for continuous improvement. And those two things, one way or another, are responsible for failures of, for example, providing a water system that delivers water, and the option, therefore, is for trucks to deliver it with crooked politicians. Now, the question of why business, and by business, by the way, I mean real commercial applications. So just to make sure, commercial applications are things that the revenue exceeds cost so that there's a surplus. That surplus can be maintained through time, so it's not accidental. And thirdly, that surplus is equal or greater than that provided by similar activities in the economy.
Thank you. Now, Patrick, I'll just say that I think the speakers can't really see you, so that we maybe have a different method.
I'll stand up.
People can see you from the back. So
Yeah.
Okay.
when you speak, if
Yeah.
you just stand up.
Okay.
So this question, by the odds of the draw and the fact that the government side is ahead, goes to Professor Prichett. Entrepreneurs see an opportunity when public provision of services fail. Is this good news or bad news for a sustainable provision of such services?
Okay. So let me tell you the Russian proverb. There was this bird, and it was a small little bird, and it had to fly south before the Russian winter came. So it just didn't leave soon enough. There was a huge snowstorm, snowed all over the bird. The bird's completely covered in snow, its feathers are wet, it can't fly. So it's freezing to death. As it's freezing to death, a nice cow comes along and says, "What's the matter?" He says, "Well, I'm cold and I'm wet and I can't fly south. I need to warm up. And if I warm up, I'll be able to fly south." So the cow says, "Not much I can do. I'm a cow, no opposable thumbs. Really shouldn't be talking, but it's a proverb. Best I can do is take a dump on you, because my shit is really warm. You can huddle inside the shit, and then you'll get warm, you'll dry off, and then you can fly south. Given the alternatives, great." Do that. The bird, it's getting warm. This is toasty. I'm getting warm. I'm getting ready. I'm getting ready. Along comes a wolf. Sees the bird, grabs it, wipes the mess off, eats it. It's a rough and proverb. What's the moral? Not everybody who shits on you is your enemy. Not everybody who takes you out of a pile of shit is your friend. So, back to our sort of question of, is the intervention of business good or bad for the sustainable provision of services? Keep in mind the word sustainable. There's 2 points to this. One, there is no question in the short run, when government has failed, the private sector as a coping alternative is fantastic. No question that when government schools are crappy, having private schools that will come in and educate your kids for free is terrific. Terrific. I'm super in favor of the private sector being there to cope with government failure. The problem is the sustainability on 2 levels. A, once business has gone into a profitable niche that was created that wasn't necessarily a desirable long-run situation, the profits they make encourage the continuation of that same situation. So once the politicians are in bed with business to facilitate the continuation of that poor services, it makes the problem of solving the underlying politics harder, not easier. Right? Second point is that we've got terrible government services. I agree we often have terrible government services. Nobody has written more and agitated more about terrible government services than me. Well, maybe some people, but not many because I write a lot. Okay? Now, but once you get the coping mechanism in, who copes first? Who gets out of government schools first? The rich. Right? In terms of a political constituency to reform the schools, who have you just lost the political power of? The rich. Who is politically powerful? I'll give you a hint. Look at this building. Look at this artwork. Look at the Kennedy School. The rich. Okay? Who do you lose next? From the political constituency you need to reform basic services to make sure that they're provided effectively and sustainably. The middle class. Once the middle class are gone, who do you have to agitate politically for effective basic services for the poor? You've got the poor. Okay? Go to the ed school. Carpet is this green carpet from the 1970s, right? So, the sustainability is the key point of this question. There is no question that private sector can effectively step in and do lots of things to provide services that are marketable to people who have money to pay for it. That's terrific. In the short run, it's a wonderful out of a crappy crappy basic service. But is that the sustainable solution, or is fixing the government the sustainable solution? Fixing the government.
Thank you. 2 minutes to Mr. Chu.
Terrific. I knew when we started this debate that Lant and I would agree. And we do, because actually, if government were great in providing public responsibilities, there wouldn't be any space for the private sector. But it's interesting that Lant has just described to us why government actually fails. So what happens when education that was supposed to be for everybody and is supposed to be provided for free? What happens when all the people have left and you're left with a disaster? Well, actually, let me take you to the slums of Hyderabad. In Hyderabad, the Indian system, of course, offers free public education for every kid. But 70% of the children in the slums of Hyderabad go to private schools. Why is that? Well, the public system provided by the government actually has a high absenteeism from the teachers, which are all much better qualified than the private schools. But in the private schools, and I visited many in the slums, there is a classroom which when you go in, you think that you have to turn the light on. But it's full of children that actually are in school uniforms. The space is so tight that to go to the third classroom, you have to go to the first and the second to go to the third. And there's no corridors because every corridor is a classroom. Why is it that that school is better than the public school system? Well, on Saturdays, the school mistress listens to parents. And she told me, one school mistress said to me, you know, it's really interesting. This mother came, and I know that she's totally illiterate. But she came and said to me, you know, my neighbor's son seems to speak English better than my son that comes to your school. What are you going to do about it? Because if you don't do anything about it, I'm switching my son. And there you have it. Accountability and a system that looks for continuous improvement when government fails.
Thank you. So don't sit down because this next question goes to you.
Okay.
For Mr. Chu, entrepreneurs aim to maximize profit and eliminate competition in the long run. Do monopolies help the poor? They made a big jump there from to a monopoly.
Actually, let me make a friendly amendment to the first sentence.
Mm-hmm.
I think that business, nobody maximizes profit if you're standing in a street corner selling shoddy goods. So actually, successful business is providing something of high value proposal for the longest time possible. And actually, competition, often you don't want to eliminate. What you want to be is better than your competition. And with that said, you look at great companies that deliver value to you. They're not the fly-by-night standing in a street corner. They're not the ones that are there for the quick buck. And you know that because you know the great successful institutions can be old companies like Nestlé or new companies like Apple or Compartamos Banco, which has been growing at more than 35% every year since the early 90s. And that's how you maximize profit. Having said that, though, let me assure you that monopoly, left on its own, is not good for anybody, including the poor. So, in effect, one of the duties of government is to regulate in a way so that there is open, intense competition. If you want to provide mechanisms of the market to attend to public responsibilities, then the only way to ensure that the value added that you create continues flowing and doesn't get stuck with investors or the managers of those companies that create the value, but continues flowing continuously to the benefit of the end customer, is that you have to have intense, open competition. And that is certainly one of the key roles of government, is to make sure that successful businesses, and if we're interested in the poor around the world, the poor in the world live in situations in which you see it all the time. Successful incumbents will come to government to try to raise those barriers so that they can become monopolies. It is the responsibility of those governments to make sure that that doesn't happen. And just for those of you who remember that in developing countries, government is weak. Well, let me tell you something quite interesting. Good regulators exist in countries that you may consider weak. So, for example, great regulation in the privatization of water, in one of the most successful privatizations of water, which shows again what private enterprise can do to solve with the weaknesses of a failing government, is in Manila. The privatization and the regulation of water in the Philippines is superb. The regulators in microfinance in Bolivia were superb. The regulators of the financial system in Peru have made it possible that 44 of 55 regulated financial institutions in Peru are actually microfinance. That's what you need.
Thank you. Professor Prichett, 2 minutes. Entrepreneurs maximizing profit and leading to monopolies help the poor?
So I want you to remember my answer by visualizing a duck. Can you visualize a yellow duck? As you visualize a yellow duck, what do you say? Oh, cute. Right? What's more cute than a yellow duck? You know, they waddle and they're cute. Super cute. When you have competition, private firms will compete in a way that maximizes their profits, whether or not that is in fact effective. So, when Chile opened to schools competition, the private schools that came into the market painted lots of yellow ducks on the entrance to their schools. Why? Ah, cute. I want my child in a happy environment. What could be a happier environment than a school with a yellow duck? Right? The public sector, without the accountability and incentives, did not paint yellow ducks. Kids moved to duck schools. 20 years later, the level of education performance in Chile was exactly the same as its neighbor Argentina, who had done nothing. Okay? Hyderabad is an interesting example because they've actually done a randomized study of the effect of kids going to private school in Hyderabad. And what the study found was that when you randomly moved a child from the public sector to the private sector, if that private school was Telugu medium, the actual language, the kids' learning performance went up. If that private school was English medium, the kids' learning performance went down relative to even the crappy public schools. Why? Because schools were competing on English medium because parents thought that was cool. And it was actually worse. So without the competition being on a well-informed basis provided by the government, you actually got worse outcomes rather than better outcomes of intense competition.
Without ducks. No, that was just saying we're moving on to the next question. Yeah. We've gone through 3 questions now, just for those of you who are keeping score. 2 more to go before we have a Q&A from the audience. This question goes to Professor Prichett. Businesses seem to need governments and vice versa. Which conditions are needed for this interaction to happen effectively? Businesses need governments and vice versa. What conditions are needed for this interaction to happen effectively? 5 minutes.
Okay. So businesses do need governments. That's why they buy them. So the question is, what? So the question is, what needs to happen for that interaction to happen effectively is there has to be a situation of accountability. I am 100% behind the notion of accountability. But the question is, if you don't have the fundamental relationship of accountability of the government to the citizens themselves strongly built in, then the government interaction between business and government will be an interaction in which business buys government and then uses government to make profits. And will they make profits? Yes. Will they sustain those profits? Yes. Will those profits sustained be the result of providing better basic services to the poor? Probably not. So the key to the successful business-government interaction, paradoxically, is accountability to citizens to governments. you don't have accountability of governments to citizens, then the intervention of business doesn't make things better. It can make things worse, right? So the successful interaction doesn't depend on what business does and what government does. It depends on what citizens do. And without well-structured political mechanisms in which the citizens can articulate their voice and control over the government, you don't have productive business-government interactions. Once you have well-structured political mechanisms for citizens to voice their control over the government can in fact create an environment for business in which business does make profits providing basic services to the poor, and we're off to the races and it's all terrific. So I'm not saying government should have a monopoly on services. I'm not saying government should be hostile to business. But if you don't create the basic foundation of the political structure of citizen control over government, that's what's necessary for the business-government interaction to be productive. Thank you.
Lant, you and I must be reading different articles. Actually, articles by Dr. James Tooley, which gauges the effectiveness of school children in private schools versus public schools in slums. Actually, all the ones that I've seen show a consistent superiority of the results of the private schools. Your colleague from the Kennedy School that has done some marvelous studies in Pakistan also show that in rural Pakistan, private schools versus public schools, you have to stay 2 more years in the public school to catch up to what the private school does. But you've just told us that governments can be bought. And actually, if you're poor, we've been waiting for a few thousand years for that marvelous government in which everything works and citizens get to express their choices in perfect ways. Well, those things exist. They just happen to be like Switzerland. But for the majority of the people in the world, we live in situations in which governments can be bought. So I ask you, if you are one of the 4 billion people of 6.5 billion people in the world that are in the base of the pyramid, what is your vote worth? Is it worth more as a citizen trying to get government that was bought to work, or is it more powerful as a consumer that exacts accountability?
Very, very good, very concise, both of you. I think you came in under your allotted time. So we're now at the last question number 5 for Mr. Chu. You usually talk about the need for companies in the public services domain to gain extraordinary returns. I think I've heard you talk about that. Why is this? Are there any ethical considerations about the need for companies in the public services domain to gain extraordinary returns? 5 minutes.
Of course there are ethical considerations. So let me start there. When you think about these basic services that can change people's lives, let me tell you what the ethical thing is. The ethical thing can be summarized by an acronym, BEST. B as the best option that is effective. E as an economical, at the lowest price that is possible. S is solidarity for everybody that needs it. And T is urgently, today. And let me suggest to you that that's the standard of success for any social action, for anything that's important for society. So the question is, what gives you best? And let me suggest to you that there are 4 things that you need in order to get best. You need, first, scale. You need to reach millions of people if your problem is in the billions. You need something that can be sustained through generations for today's people, for the children and their children's children. And you need a model that has continuous efficacy, that gets better and better through time. And you need continuous efficiency, which is cheaper and cheaper through time.
You have 2 minutes.
Now, let me suggest to you that in history, there's been only one thing that can provide those four things consistently and simultaneously, and that's been business. But not through one company. See, companies are like people. They get lazy, they forget what made them great, they want to create monopolies, and they die. I'm so old that I remember the days in which the standard for an airline was Pan American Airways. So it's not through a firm, it's through an industry. Now you all know that, because you all know, I know, you have an intelligent PDA in your pocket. What you know for sure is that next year you'll be able to buy for your dollar a better PDA. Why is that? What you don't know is it iPhone? Is it going to be Android? Is it going to be Motorola? And those of you who are very old might remember Nokia. And the thing is, you don't care. But the reason why that's for sure is because there's an industry providing it. And I know only one way to create an industry. You have to have an economic activity, and you have to have above average returns. Why would you do anything new, especially if it's serving the poor, if it's got average or below market returns? So you need above average returns. And that's the social role of profit. But if you're going to use market mechanisms, as I told you, the only way to ensure that the value added continues flowing to the end user is if you have open, intense competition. That's the social role of industries. And so actually, that's why you need the best news for the poor is if something that really can change their lives can generate superior profitability. And I've often thought, if there was the same return on equity feeding people in 5-star restaurants as feeding the poor, there wouldn't be one poor person on earth hungry.
Thank you. And now for the last rebuttal to the question, you usually talk about the need for companies in the public services domain to gain extraordinary returns, or you might not.
I do.
Why is this, and are there any ethical considerations?
When we go back to basic and government versus business, the most basic service of all is physical security of your person. Right? There has to be the sense that this debate is not going to be resolved by fisticuffs. And if there is, gets into fisticuffs, that there's some neutral arbiter that will prevent that eruption of violence. The problem is that is a monopoly. You cannot have competitive provision of the rule of law and the enforcement of security. So the bedrock of the provision of all services is the government providing the framework of a set of neutral rules within which services can be provided, right? That cannot be subject to competition. And the difficulty is, while I fully agree that extraordinary returns are an absolutely essential feature of businesses being engaged in providing services to the poor, unfortunately, there are two paths to extraordinary returns. One path is monopoly through getting the government on your side to prevent other people from being competitors, and I am as big a believer in competition as you can find. And the other is doing a good job. And as you look around the world, you will see firms of every type. Firms that survive and thrive. Matter of fact, in India today, there are two brothers that illustrate this point perfectly. Both are making huge profits. One is making huge profits specializing in what we call non-tradable contracts, meaning he's doing things for the government and has bought the government, and there are extraordinary returns to buying the government. The other brother is making money by providing effective services. So I'm all in favor of extraordinary returns, but without a bedrock of government providing the basic services, those extraordinary returns will not be gained by providing services to the poor.
Thank you very much. That concludes the one-on-one portion of the debate, and the votes are still coming in, though it's tightening actually.
No, but I think I lost on value-added terms, though.
Well, yes, that's right. The business side is the business
It's
side
diffs
is
and diffs. Everybody understands it's diffs and diffs. Right?
yeah. 53 for the government and 42 for business. Okay, obviously some great points in there on both sides, and rather than recap now, let's take the opportunity for a 10-minute Q&A. So please keep your questions short and to the point so we can get as many in as possible, and I indicate to whom you're addressing the question, if one, as opposed to the other.
And are you going to take 6 or how many?
Oh,
Take 4 or 5.
yeah, I don't know. Oh, you mean at a time?
Yeah.
You want to do that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's better than one.
Okay,
at a
good.
time.
Okay, we'll take a few. Yeah. Okay.
My name is HBS.
Speak up a bit. Yeah.
One of the basic services for the poor in many countries, at least, is healthcare. And there's a huge debate here in the U.S., and that would set an example for other countries about providing or not providing healthcare. So, what is your point of view for both panelists about this provision of healthcare to the poor, taking into account that the most, let's say, free market point of view possible? So, if you take into account the existence of free markets, should the government do it or not?
Okay. Good. So, healthcare is a public good, and what's the role of government or business? Okay. Let's take a few more questions before we.
Yeah, this is more for the business side. So when we talk about 4 billion people, of those 4 billion, there's probably 1 billion or so that live under $1 a day. So that's like extreme poverty. How do we provide a service, get them, pay for a service like education or water or health when they're earning that little? Because I understand for the other 3 billion, there's opportunities, and we're seeing this in China, but for the poor,
Right. Okay.
So we've talked a lot about traditional businesses.
Stand up and turn around so people can hear you.
So we've talked a lot about traditional businesses and what incentives they have, but we've not really touched upon the new breed of businesses which have a double or a triple bottom line with both social motives and profit motives, and I was wondering what's your take on that?
Okay. Should we take one more? Do we have one?
This question is one for Professor Xu. You mentioned that there needs to be an extraordinary profit potential for businesses to enter in providing services. What if there are segments of the population in which there is no profitable reason to serve them? So if there's this remote village on top of a mountain that profitably you cannot deliver electricity to them, would they be excluded out of this service, or is there a way to business?
Okay, great question. Okay, so let's take those four. The first one on healthcare and how would you provide it. The second one on people on $1 a day, how can they afford to pay for these great schools from the private sector or even the government. Not much mention of the triple line, bottom line business. Where do you see that? And then, of course, the as they call it, the last mile, the remote rural village is the hardest to reach. How do we reach those with either government or business? So,
Should I take a
You
first?
had
take
no
a
other
stab.
questions. Why don't
Take
you
a
start?
stab. Yeah.
I'll try to answer all 4 questions in my flow of thought. First of all, in healthcare, you know what business can do well is provide a very focused response to an easily identifiable need. So actually, the way that I see healthcare coming together is that what's really great for business is going into that 80% of the healthcare activities that represent 20% of the cost, and leave for the public sector the 20% of the activities that represent 80% of the cost. And let me tell you why that's a good idea. Because actually, You see, when a poor person has brain tumor and has to be operated, there's nobody but the government that can step in to somebody who is in that lowest 1 billion to take care of that tumor operation. But if it is a earache of a child, if it is all those things that actually represent the 80% of the time that you go to the health service, that private enterprise can do. And so for society, it would be great, in my view, if government can reserve all that expenditure that it spends in health to apply it to that 20% that represents the major cost, and leave for the market actually taking care of the 80%, which it can do much better. So for the 1 billion at the tail end, the problem, of course, is if you're going to look at market solutions, those that cannot pay, it's really challenging to face them, to take care of them. But let me say to you that there's a hospital called Narayana Heart Hospital in Bangalore in India, which, applying manufacturing techniques, has taken the break-even cost of open heart surgery to $1,800. Now, this is interesting in India because what you need in India is 2.5 million open heart surgeries, and there are only 60,000 performed. Now, Narayana also, if you look at the economics, has a 60% return on equity. 6-0. How does it apply it? It applies it in a way in which it cross-subsidizes. It charges people that can pay the full freight, and uses the profit to then subsidize the care of that 1 billion in which there are people that are having open heart surgery for free. Now, they're all being operated in the same world-class surgery. However, one has 5-star hotel, private room, etc. The other one is in a public ward.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm just going to answer two of the questions. The first is healthcare is a perfect example, one of the confusion, and the second of what markets do. So provision versus production. Nearly every country in the world produces healthcare with private sector operators. They provide healthcare by providing the financing that flows to those operators. So again, it's the perfect example. Insurance provides the financing with which private sector, individually incentivized and accountable doctors provide care. So let's be clear about production versus provision, and I would never recommend that any government take entire responsibility for the production of healthcare services, because it's not the kind of thing that government does well. But every government assumes responsibility for the provision of healthcare services, however they discharge that function. Second, this is another perfect, well-documented, empirically example. A friend of mine did a study of people who provide medical services in Delhi, not by going to doctors and seeing what they did, but by going to people and found who they went to for medical services. Turns out they went to lots of different people for medical services, usually to the private sector, but the private sector, 17% of the people who provided medical services didn't have a high school degree. Because people would go and they'd say it's cheap and they'd pay them a little money and they'd get some medical advice. Okay? Now, what was interesting is that when you compared the technical knowledge and capacity of the public sector and the private sector, the public sector knew tons more what medically they should do because they were better trained. In practice, however, government failed. The government doctors in their practices in the public sector weren't correctly incentivized and so provided really crappy care relative to what they knew what to do. The private sector did exactly what it knew how to do, but a lot of what it did was actually contraindicated, meaning it was actually bad for your health. So, for instance, to be responsive to the need of the patient, private doctors would give you antibiotics. even for conditions they knew antibiotics had no impact on. Why? Made the patient happy. What do you go to a doctor for? To do something, right? So what does the private sector do? They do something. Unfortunately, a lot of what they do either has no impact on your health condition at all, or oftentimes made it worse. So in the end, in India, in this particular study, who had better provision of service, public sector or private sector? They were both equally crappy, but for completely different reasons. Because they hadn't gotten the relationship between the government provision of the context for enforcing quality and making prices work, and the government and the private sector production of effective services right. So you can make mistakes on both sides, and we often do.
Thank you both for being so clear and using so many great examples, and for not resorting to any theory or I expected a lot of talk about the World Bank and NGOs, but we heard none of that, which was great. And Russian proverbs are always good. And nothing wrong with the World Bank, of course. No. It just surprised me that we didn't hear anything about it. And likewise, thank you both. So now we have final remarks, 4 minutes each. And you can keep voting. The vote now stands: government 53.8, business 41.7. And I just wanted to kind of recap just a couple of the key points that both sides made. Obviously, they made many great points. On the government side, the idea that the government doesn't necessarily have to be the producer, but is always the provider, should be the provider and provide the infrastructure and primarily the security and the framework and the regulations for private enterprise to thrive. And that government really needs accountability and should try to build it in its citizens, because it needs a strong middle class that will pressure the government to produce and provide better. And if it's just all rich, as in many poor countries, then you don't have that kind of countervailing impact. On the business side, Michael said that if government was so good, there'd be no room for business. So obviously, there's an entry point, there's an opening. Businesses like competition. They don't necessarily like monopolies. They need competition to provide value, because only by providing value will they make profits. So they need that competition and that push. They like good regulations. They like level playing fields, and they rely on governments to provide that. And only businesses can really scale. Industries can scale. You need industries, not just a firm or a smattering of firms. You need industry to scale. And those profits might be used to subsidize other socially useful goods. So now we have 4-minute summaries from each of the, and let's start with Michael, since we started with Lant on the first question.
You know, business earns its bad name every single day. It's easy to say that because we just went through a few years in which, in 2008, business almost sank Western civilization as we know it. So actually, the issue is not that business can do things always better, or actually that there are no abuses from business. Actually, Lant and I have been talking this afternoon, actually, of massive failure on both sides. We talked about healthcare. Well, do you know that the poorer the country is, the higher the percentage is already being handled by business? So in India, where all these disasters that Nat mentioned take place, 76 cents of the $1 spent on healthcare is already being spent in markets. The issue then is that business right now, together with government, is doing a terrible job. Terrible. And if you're poor, if you're in the 4 billion of the 6.5 billion, you are from badly served to dismally served. Government should get better, and that should be a priority for all of us as citizens. But we've been waiting several thousand years for government to get to a point where it can deliver what, from a normative point of view, it ought to deliver. So when I look at the situation of massive failure for the poor of the world, actually where I see the hope is actually releasing the one party that has been absent from this fight. This fight against poverty has been, really the actors have been philanthropy, developmental agencies, NGOs, and government. For various reasons, none of them are structured in terms of delivering massive scale, sustainability, continuous efficiency, and continuous efficacy. So for me, the great promise is actually bringing business, but not the crappy business that gives you the healthcare of India. It is actually applying the best skills and standards of business, because that's the one that's been absent. We've been devoting everything we know to serving the top of the pyramid, and we do a fantastic job. So the challenge is actually taking everything that we know about that and applying it to the 4 billion. And that's where the promise against poverty lies. And it's really, really relevant this afternoon, because what it means is you all that are here, that actually represent the talent pool that can make a difference. So my closing statement to you is, if you care about any of this, just take that and apply the best standards through the means that can really make a huge difference really quickly, which is go and do it. Devote business at the base of the pyramid.
So I'll start with another story, and it's about healthcare in India. And I'm not picking on India. I love India. I'm moving to India in a few months to live again in India. I've lived in India before. India is actually one of the better countries in the world in terms of public services. So if you look at the rankings of public services, it's in the top half. Okay? So I have a friend who's one of the world's leading experts on health economics. He was living in India at the same time with me, and he got a call one day from his driver and said, "You've got to help me. My father's dying." And so he said, "Okay, great. How can I help?" Well, I took my father to a public hospital, and he was blue. He was dying of congestive heart failure, so he couldn't oxygenate his blood. He was blue, and the public sector doctor said, "He's fine, he can go home." And his driver said, "I'm not a doctor, but I know blue is not a good color for people." But when I went to the private hospital, they have to be paid up front, and I need to borrow some money. So my friend said, "Great, I'll lend you some money to get into the private hospital." Got the man into the private hospital. A day later, called his driver, said, "How's he doing?" He says, "He's great." You know, they obviously there was something wrong. They fixed it. That's a great story about the private sector. 2 days later, the driver got a call from my friend. My friend got a call from his driver. "Sir, you have to help me." "What's gone wrong this time?" "I can't get my father out of the hospital. They say he's still sick. He's better, but he's still sick. And they're charging me this enormous daily rate to keep him in the hospital. And until I can pay them all that I owe them, they're going to keep him in the hospital, and I'm going to go bankrupt because I can't get him out of the hospital." So my friend again had to intervene and get him out of the private sector hospital, who, once they had their grips on him and had cured him, was willing to milk him for all the profits they could get. Terrible story about the private sector. Okay? What's the real answer? The answer is, when the politics are right, the profits are right. So I am the biggest fan of business going out and using their innovative, incentivized things to make profits. And when the prices are right, making profits will in fact lead to huge benefits for the world's citizens. And if the government can make serving the poor a profitable endeavor, the business will be terrific at education, the business will be terrific at housing, the business will be terrific at healthcare. But if the politics are wrong, the profits will be wrong, and driving more and more business initiative into distorted political situations that perpetuate the ability to make profits by manipulating services does not make things better. So if the politics are wrong, the profits are wrong. So, profits follow politics. What should you go out and fix? If you are in a situation in which the politics are right and making profits serves the poor, go for the profits. All for it. If you are in a situation where the politics are wrong, you can make a lot of money and not benefit anybody, and be part of the problem, not part of the solution. So if the politics are wrong, devote yourself to fixing the politics, because that's what will ultimately be able to create the situation in which the politics are right, the profits are right, and you can unleash the private sector in fulfilling all kinds of objectives, including basic services for the poor. So if the politics are wrong, got to fix the politics first. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again. So we're wrapping up. After the final remarks, if you want to change your vote, one more chance. As Michael said, we've been waiting 1,000 years for the perfect government. And Lant didn't say this, but he might have. Ever since Adam Smith, we've been waiting for the perfect business, and we still haven't found it. Though Michael has found a few. So I'm sure the debate will go on. But as I said before, this probably wouldn't have been happening 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, or maybe after Prahalad's book it might have happened. But so it's a great to see the evolution. I think it's a great experiment, the debate, and let's see who the winner is. Government, 53.2.
You're not doing diffs and diffs, though. Every time I talk, I lose.
Business, business 43.2. So this was an away game for the government side. But as I said, I bet you if you had taken
log out and log back in again, you can vote twice.
10 or 20.
There's $1 in it.
But 10 or 20 years ago, the vote would have been much more lopsided, probably. So business is. Anyway, thank you to the organizers. Great idea, great concept. Thank you for asking me, and thank you to both of you. You're both fabulous. And I think
everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. A special thanks to Professor Lant and Professor Chu and Nick Sullivan for we're extremely grateful that you're here and made this a very interesting debate. And we hope this is the first event out of many cross-campus events, especially in this topic that we're all very, very interested in discussing and debating.